Dr. Jerry Moon, thank you for joining us for a good conversation about your work and your life and everything you've done at Andrews University in the Church History Department. So thank you so much for your time.
Welcome.
I wanted to ask you, first of all, what led you into the historical profession?
Well, I was not particularly interested in being a professional historian early on. My parents were church school teachers and very, very faithful, consistent Adventists. I was born in '49, so I grew up in the '50s, and my parents were not conservative in the ideological way that we think of it now, but they were careful to live the way they believed God wanted them to. They read the Bible and they read Ellen White, tried to follow it in a common sense way. My parents always had morning and evening worship. They were church school teachers, so for up until we finished 8th grade, we all went to school together. And my mom would pack 5 lunches in the evening, and so my parents were very consistent in their faith. We did not have a television in our home because my parents observed that when television became common in the early '50s, that the students who had televisions in their home, their academic performance dropped immediately. And many times they were up late at night and all kinds of things. And they were very careful about not needlessly exposing ourselves to various things that they didn't think were wholesome. So we didn't have a television, but my parents purchased reel-to-reel tape recordings of King's Heralds and other Adventist music. And it would play by the hour in our home when we were home. Mm-hmm. And my mom loved to sing. And when we were driving in the car together, if some of us kids got squabbling, Mom would start up a song, and pretty soon we'd all join in. And that's kind of the way it was. So my parents were very positive Adventists, and yet careful about their religion. And I felt fairly early a call to ministry, and when I went off to academy, my parents bought me a complete set of the Conflict of the Ages series, complete set of the 9 volumes of the Testimonies, and a complete set of the SDA Bible Commentary, and the 2 or 3 volumes that went with it at that time.
Wow.
And so that kind of molded their expectations of me, as well as some of my reading. And so I was early introduced to reading Ellen White, and so during my MDiv program, I really got deeply interested in being a teacher. I just thought, to be a teacher in the seminary would be the top of the world. I didn't really expect it to happen, but it gradually became my ambition. And the last year I was in seminary, I took a field school of evangelism, and at that point I saw something that I hadn't seen before, because all the evangelism I was acquainted with was long series of meetings with 2 or 3 people baptized at the end. Mm-hmm. And we went to a big series in Charlotte, North Carolina that lasted 5 weeks plus a few weekends of follow-up, and baptized, 50, 60, 70 people. And I said, this is good stuff. Mm-hmm. And I really felt that one of the things I dreaded about the possibility of ministry is being a fruitless pastor, nothing happening year after year. So we asked our conference if they would let us go work with that evangelist for a year, if we would be responsible for our upkeep, and they gave us permission. We first asked if they'd sponsor us, but they said we have no budget for that. So I said, well, if we can manage it without a sponsorship, would you give us your blessing and have a place for us when we're done? And they agreed to that. So that changed our focus. And so we pastored for several years. We did several evangelistic meetings with some success. Nothing like the big guys, but enough to, anyway, eventually I realized that I was not going to be satisfied to be a district pastor. For one thing, I wasn't a very crackerjack pastor. I worked very hard for my results, and some of my friends that were spending a day or two a week on the golf links were baptizing more people than I was. And then I realized that I'm not really a people person. I'm more a book person. And so I was wondering what was happening. Anyway, eventually the door opened up, and one of my favorite teachers at seminary said, Jerry, when are you going to come back and do a PhD and become a teacher? And all the lights came on. In retrospect, I realized what the Lord accomplished. I pastored about 11 years. What the Lord accomplished during that time was He really took me down several notches. Because at seminary, I made not quite a 4.0, but real close to it. I think I had one grade that, no, that was in the PhD. I had one grade that missed A, but the MDiv wasn't quite that good. Anyway, I was close to the top of my classes, and I thought that, I was pretty good guy, and I expected to be one of the most successful pastors when I got out there, and it didn't happen. Then I realized there's a lot more to being a good pastor than just being good with books. And so the Lord humbled me, and just when I had given up on succeeding at anything, He opened the way for me to come to seminary, and it was like a fish back in the water. And so anyway, when it came to choosing an area, you'll laugh at this, but I reasoned that we got guys that specialize in Old Testament, we got guys that specialize in New Testament. There ought to be somebody here that specializes in Ellen White. And I took Adventist studies because that's the background to Ellen White. And at that time, I visualized the church history department as the place where we would do exegesis of Ellen White, like the others did exegesis of Old Testament and New Testament.
I see. Okay.
Eventually, as I got a little more into the practicality of it, I realized that that was an opinion that probably grew out of my academy and early college experience and was not tenable in the long term, because the Bible is our basis, not Ellen White.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So, but anyway, that's what prompted me to get into Adventist studies, and also SDA history courses were some of my favorites on the MDiv level.
Okay.
But I didn't think of myself as becoming a historian so much as becoming an expert on Ellen White.
Exegetical expert, perhaps?
Well.
Or historical expert?
Yeah.
Or that's the question?
Both, yeah.
Both. Okay.
So anyway, that was kind of the background there.
Well, what was the state of the field like whenever you, I guess maybe to back up a little bit more even, like you're there then, but what was it that led you to actually choose the historical profession? You said you were gravitating to some of these classes in your MDiv program, but you didn't really think of yourself as a historian. But then when does that switch happen? Like when do you start to realize, okay, this is what I'm going to try to do now?
Yeah, well, I guess it's partly influenced by some of the historians I've known that saw themselves a historian first and an Adventist second. And I always felt that I was Adventist first of all over everything, and that God had called me to ministry, and whatever I did in the area of history was in the service of Adventist ministry, not the other way around.
Okay.
So
does this involve the context of you growing up and ministering maybe in the 70s and 80s and some of the challenges the church was facing in those decades. Does that play a role in this at all?
Yes, I'm sure that has something to do with it, because I remember that as I got deeper into Adventist studies in my PhD program, and I began to feel like I had solved some of these problems in my own mind, like the perennial debate over Christ's human nature, whether he was exactly like us or was he partly like us and partly not. And I eventually came to where I felt like I had a pretty good handle on that for myself, and I wanted to write a book on it, actually. I'm currently chairing a dissertation. The student's done a very good job, probably better than I would have done maybe, but hopefully we're going to get him graduated by the end of the year.
Great.
But so the Lord gave me the opportunity to work with a lot of these questions, but not to do them all myself.
Well, okay, so from your perspective, when you were starting your PhD program, and you started your PhD program in what, 1987?
Mm-hmm.
So when you're starting your PhD program, were you initially starting in Adventist studies?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were you one of the first PhDs in Adventist studies at the seminary?
I believe I was I did some figuring on that, and I got some notes there. I'm shuffling the paper. Yeah, I believe I was the second. No, I think I was the third to start and the first to finish.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. The first to start, to my knowledge, was Daniel Heinz.
Yeah,
who was
okay.
at
He's at Friedenau, right?
Friedenau, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And because I have some notes that I took at his defense.
Oh, okay.
At his defense, I think it was either the first or the second PhD dissertation defense that I had attended. This would have been 88 or 89, something like that. And he was writing on the history of the German Adventist Church before World War II or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And he had depended on a lot of oral testimony. He had gone to Germany and, well, he lived there. He had interviewed a lot of the older Adventists and based his dissertation largely on that, because most of the official records had been destroyed during World War II. And his committee, I'd talked to some of them years later, Mervyn Maxwell told me that they tried their best to persuade him not to go to defense because he wasn't ready. But he was so sure he was ready that he didn't want to make any more changes. So they finally said, okay, we'll let you defend. But he was supposed to have triangulated all these oral sources and not considered them authoritative unless they could be verified by two other sources. And he had taken them as gospel all by themselves. And so Maxwell and Daniel Augsburger were on his committee, and I forget who the third person was, but George Knight was the fourth reader. And I remember vividly, the dissertation was up on the third floor of the library in a room up there. I mean, the defense. And the defense seemed to be going very well until we got to the fourth reader. And George Knight just sort of dismantled the dissertation and put the pieces out in piles. And the conclusion was that he had to completely rewrite chapter 2, which was the one that was based on oral sources. And George Knight showed that he had not adequately supported or demonstrated the accuracy or the dependability of those sources. So it was 2 or 3 years, because he was back in Germany full-time teaching then. Well, he was here when he defended, but right after his defense, he had agreed to go, and he thought he was done. But now he had chapter 2 to rewrite, and a lot of additional work to do. So it was several years since he was now teaching full time. So meanwhile, I started in '87 and graduated in '93, and I think he was the second one then to graduate. He finished soon after I did. And then I believe Björgvin Snorreson was the third.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And
I think so.
I don't have when he started, but I do have a letter that he wrote to me in when I was just new as the chair in 2002, and he wrote a letter to me and said that this is August 2002. He wanted to restart his program. He said, I completed all the research. I've more or less written the proposal with a complete bibliography. I've written hundreds of pages in Norwegian on the subject. Now, my understanding is that he was here long enough to finish his classwork, and I didn't encounter him in any of my classwork, so he must have been done by the fall of '87 or spring of '88. And then he went back to, he was teaching in Iceland. He's originally from Norway. He went back to Iceland, was a full-time pastor and part-time teacher in some of their schools. And for about 6 years, he did his research and rough drafted the whole dissertation in Norwegian. And then when he had it basically finished, he contacted me. That was in 2002. So I'm guessing that, anyway, the chronology there is not completely clear. But anyway, he completed his new proposal in English in November 2005, and he completed the dissertation in 2010. So I believe he was actually the fourth to finish, because meanwhile Michael Campbell had started in 2005 and finished in 2008.
Wow. So there were that few between starting in roughly 1985 and then 2010?
I believe so. I'm not absolutely positive.
Sure.
But
Okay.
that's the ones I made some notes here of. But what I discovered in the process was that I've been either the chair or a member of the committee for most of the ones that have graduated since then.
That's amazing. I did not realize that. I saw that your lists that you sent me, and I wondered if they were actually complete because they were so short. I figured that there had been more graduates and PhD studies.
Well, somebody estimated around a dozen.
Studies. A dozen, really? Okay.
And I counted 11 that were actually in Adventist studies, plus Dennis Kaiser, who did his MA in Adventist studies, but did his PhD in systematic theology with a minor in church history.
I didn't even realize that.
Okay. Or he might have done his MA in church history. Anyway, he came with a very strong background in Ellen White studies because he had worked for the White Estate before he came to Andrews. And he had come through Bogenhofen, so he was stellar from the beginning.
Well, let's back up and talk about what it was like in the Adventist history world when you started your PhD in 1987. So what was, from your perspective, what was the state of the field? You mentioned how there are some historians who consider themselves a historian first and then an Adventist second. You considered yourself an Adventist first and a historian second? I don't know if that's the right kind of way to put it.
Yeah, actually, when you said the state of the field, I wasn't yet thinking like a historian. I was thinking like an Adventist minister that wanted to be educated enough to settle some of these vexed questions that were dividing the church. And so it was only gradually as I got into my PhD program that I began to realize, there is a historical methodology and all this stuff. So I gradually became a historian.
Yeah, sure.
But Yeah, when you said the state of the field, Richard Schwartz, Light Bearers to the Remnant, was copyright, I think, in
79, I believe.
79. Yeah, that's right. And that was the most authoritative work. The SDA Encyclopedia was second most authoritative, I suppose, or the one that you'd go to for a quick reference. And it was nothing like the new online one.
Yeah, well, you didn't even have the 1996 version either.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So you had the one
So
from
it
the
was-
50s.
And the other books that were available, I mean, Arthur Spalding's from the 50s or early 60s was the most comprehensive, I guess. And but George Knight was just getting started. He had published Early Adventist Educators, and I'm not sure what else, but Myths in Adventism was the one that really, where he crossed over from history of Adventist education into general Ellen White and Adventist lifestyle. And that's really what put him on the map. And I don't know the backstory to his transfer from education to the seminary, but Mervyn Maxwell was chair of the department at that time, and he recognized that George Knight was really cutting some new ground, and he was convinced that he was a trustworthy person. And so Mervyn Maxwell was the one who basically began to, maybe he didn't initiate it, but he was the chair when George transferred from School of Ed to seminary.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure exactly what year that was, but it wasn't much before I came.
Yeah. In a recent email to me, he said it was June of 1985.
Okay.
So.
Okay, well then that's probably what triggered the, okay, that's it. So if 1985 was the beginning of the Adventist studies, that's when Maxwell recognized that we needed more depth in Adventist studies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's what brought George.
Yeah. I'm going to interview George in a few weeks, but yeah, he told me in an email that it was June of 1985, and he came for the purpose of getting this off the ground, the Adventist Studies program off the ground. And so it apparently is starting about then, I guess the fall of fall semester of 85, or maybe you said it was on the quarter system then, so I don't know.
Yeah, it's quarter system.
Did a new quarter start around June then? Or would it maybe have been July?
Let's see, the winter quarter was January to March. Spring quarter was middle of March to 1st of June, just 10-week quarters.
Okay, so he comes on for the third quarter of the year then.
Yeah.
So I guess the third quarter would have been roughly whenever it was kind of officially started, although they probably don't have a PhD student quite yet until maybe Daniel Hines. So yeah, okay. Well, yeah, so you had basically the tools that you had to work with are Spalding, Light Bearers, Richard Schwartz, and the encyclopedia. And then Myths of Adventism came out, I think, in 85. So you had something like that, and then I think Early Adventist Educators was 83 maybe?
Something like that.
So there was George Knight had a couple of books under his belt by the time he's starting there, but
yeah, and I think some of his books in educational philosophy, he may have had the first edition out.
okay.
Anyway, you'll have a very interesting interview with him.
Well, from your perspective, in 1987, was George Knight really someone who was known, or was he like did
he was just becoming known. He really wasn't known very widely.
So as a student, from your perspective, when you go into the classroom to sit in a class with George Knight, did you go in with this feeling of this is just a young guy who's supposed to be pretty good, or was it like, oh, this is George Knight, I've heard a lot about him?
Well, we were beginning, of course, at Andrews we heard a lot about him.
Okay.
I don't know how much beyond Andrews, but he was an exciting teacher. And of course, you've had classes from him, I suppose.
I didn't. I
didn't?
entirely missed that. Yeah, not a single one.
This is a big statement, and it might be slightly exaggerated, but I would say he he was one of 2 or 3 most exciting teachers in the seminary at the time, because he could say very ordinary things in provocative ways that really made you sit up and say, is that really true? And he taught development of SDA lifestyle, and he taught development of SDA theology, and he taught 2 or 3 other courses in that cluster. And he taught a seminar in SDA lifestyle. That's actually the first course I took from him in the fall of '87, was a seminar in SDA lifestyle that was focused on the issue of movies. And I wrote my first paper on, forget the focus of it now, but it was basically on Adventist attitudes toward movies. And I remember it was close to 50 pages, and he gave me a good grade on it and said, this is good representative doctoral work. I'm proud of you. So
Great. What a great way to begin.
So, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, good. What about journals and places to publish on Adventist history? Where would you seek publication at that time, and what were the coveted journals to be published in?
Well, there wasn't much.
I didn't think so.
Adventist Heritage was the possibility.
Mm-hmm.
I never published there. We'd get book reviews in AUSS, and sometimes somebody would publish an article. I eventually published some articles in AUSS, but not early on. And in fact, a lot of my term papers went unpublished because there wasn't any appropriate place for them.
Okay.
And quite a few of them got reworked and published in the SDA Encyclopedia and the Ellen White Encyclopedia, because I hadn't found any other place that wanted something that was that focused on Ellen White.
Okay, well, good. Okay.
See, the seminary was quite a bit more conservative in those days than it is now. I'm not throwing any stones either way, but I'm just saying that Hazel was the was the dean, and he had been picked precisely by people that wanted to keep the seminary conservative, and there were a few that kind of slipped away in his early years. I remember 1 or 2 guys that had their PhDs from Harvard and places like that were just not considered quite trustworthy to the old-time Adventists. And Hazel was kind of chosen as dean to clean house a little bit. And anyway, Hazel and Mervyn Maxwell and, there were several others that were, they weren't hostile, but they were very convinced conservatives. And Spectrum was just viewed as kind of a journal for disaffected Adventists.
Ah, okay. So we got that reputation by the 80s for sure.
Oh, I'm sure.
I believe you.
And
it wasn't originally that way, but
yeah. And then what was the other one that came out a little later? It was a little bit more moderate. Something about Adventist. There was Adventist in the heading.
Adventist Affirm? Are you talking about that one?
No.
Yeah, that one's more right wing, at least.
Yeah, Adventist Affirm actually was quite strongly supported in the faculty here. I would probably a minority, but a very strong minority. And when in thinking about what were the controversial issues, topics of discussion in those, when I first came in 87, 88, 89, I'm not sure exactly when. You mentioned here that Adventist Affirm was launched in 87. So I was here about the time the first issue came out. And that was the only major controversy going on, was the role of women.
Oh, yeah, right.
And,
right.
And a lot of people at that point were basically neutral on it. They were not opposed to women in ministry, and they weren't promoting it either. And so Adventist Affirm took a very strong stance against, at least against ordination of women, and in favor of limited roles for women in ministry. And so that that began to sensitize people, and people began to study it and take sides. And so anyway.
One of the reasons I put Adventist Affirm on this list is because Maxwell, in fact, was very attached to that.
Oh, yes.
Very much. So, and he ends up editing the thing for many years. So, did he promote?
Well, actually, Bill Fagel was the editor, I think.
Well, but for a period of years.
Oh, okay, Maxwell did too.
Maxwell,
also,
yeah. So, not the initial, not the one who launched it.
Yeah.
He wasn't the initial editor, but he dies, I think, as the editor of Adventist Affirm.
Yeah, because one of the notes after he died, I mean, shortly after, was that he was editing articles for Adventist Affirm the day he died.
From his hospital bed.
From his hospital bed, yeah.
That's right. So, but I haven't seen a whole lot of works, publications on Adventist history in those early years. So it doesn't seem like it was a very...
No, it was not a historical, except the history of role of women.
Yeah. And it was taking the conservative side on that one.
Yeah.
Were you thinking of Adventist Today? Is that the other?
Yes, Adventist Today.
Okay, so that launches around this time too. Actually, I don't know.
No, it was a bit later.
Was it a bit
probably
later?
The 90s.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway, I was a reader of that and would have considered contributing to that for a little while, but I gradually became disillusioned with it. I felt like you had to read with your eyes wide open and process everything. If you just read it like you were just reading the news and you take in the arguments as factual, pretty soon you're going to find you've got quite different views. And I wasn't sure that I was willing to do that. So
Sure. Well, another thing I wanted to ask you about is Ron Number's Prophetess of Health. So was that a big major topic of discussion or book to contend with, or was it viewed favorably by some and not others? Or
I would say it was mostly ignored.
Mostly ignored, okay.
Yes, there were a few reading it, but the people that were reading Spectrum were the ones that were aware of it, and people that worked for the White Estate, because the White Estate did a rebuttal. Mm-hmm. And of course I was working here for the White Estate, and I got a hold of the rebuttal, and reading the rebuttal before I read the book, I didn't see any need to read the book.
Have you read it?
I read a fair amount of it eventually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but not
because
cover to
there
cover.
were some issues that touched issues in my dissertation.
Okay.
And for that I did some reading in it, but I never did get it read cover to cover.
Oh wow. Oh, fair enough.
But
fair enough.
I did read Ron Grable's dissertation pretty much cover to cover, I think.
Oh, which he's now published. I think 2019 or so he published it.
Yeah, it was unpublished for a long time.
Yeah, okay. So mostly ignored, so including professors and people didn't talk about it in class much, huh? Or around campus?
No, except in Ellen White class. And the professors, I think, there were a few that would have felt that it was a worthwhile thing and had some truth to it, etc. Which is basically what I eventually came to conclude, that he had some important points, and if he had stated them a little bit more cautiously, he might have carried more readers. But he was very bold in some of his statements, and I guess not in the first edition, but by the second or third edition, he pretty clearly repudiated any belief in Ellen White being an inspired person. And but in the early days, there weren't many that had read him. There were a few that had heard about him. But he was viewed as kind of an ex-Adventist who was no longer viewing things from an Adventist viewpoint. So therefore, his opinion was seen as kind of invalid,
Okay.
Biased.
Do you want to talk about your experience in the Adventist PhD program, Adventist Studies PhD program, a bit more? Like what classes you took? I think you mentioned some of them.
Yeah, I looked up some of the classes I took. Oh, here's I'll leave this with you. In the 88 bulletin, there's pictures of all the guys in the department.
Okay.
Strand, Augsburger, Domsteek. Actually, Domsteek was supposed to have taught that class in the winter quarter of 88, but he was busy finishing the Seventh-day Adventists Believe 27, which he was the editor for, and he was not getting done in time, and it seemed like there might have been some other issues, but anyway, he wasn't going to be able to be there that quarter, so that's what gave me the opening to get my foot in the door.
To teach your first class?
To teach SDA history first time. And then there's Walter Douglas. He was another exciting teacher. George Knight. Maxwell was really a person that I admired as I guess kind of a quintessential Adventist. But eventually I moderated that just a little bit. You may remember a book that came out called Perfection, the Impossible Possibility. It had 4 sections, one by Maxwell, and then 3 others, I forget. One section was by Laurendale. And anyway, eventually I was a close admirer of Maxwell for quite a few years. And I took several classes from him in the early part of my program because he was the chair of the department and offered some of the seminars too. And some of those had 2 people in them, me and one other student. So, his view of perfection was he had such a high view, I eventually began to classify it as perfectionism. And it evidently worked for him, but it didn't work for me. When I believed the way he taught it, it just kept me totally focused on my behavior, and it was discouraging. And eventually I got a clearer view of righteousness by faith, and Romans 3:23 says, I'm paraphrasing to pull up some of the Greek meaning, but it says, all have sinned and continue to fall short of the glory of God, being justified continually through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. And I came to believe that the idea of overcoming one sin at a time until you finally conquered them all is untenable. The perfection that God offers us is perfection right now in Jesus. And if I am this moment, have nothing between me and Jesus, and I am living in obedience this moment, I'm counted perfect now. And so Hebrews, I think it's 10:14, says by one sacrifice he gave salvation to all or something. He made all perfect who are being sanctified. And that's the way I came to understand it, that if I am living in the process of sanctification, the very definition of the process of sanctification is that I am improving in my character and behavior over time for the rest of my life. But I'm counted perfect because I'm in obedience to Jesus at this point, and I'm living by faith in Him. So I got to keep my eyes on Him, not on me. Anyway, that worked for me. So I no longer could subscribe to exactly the way Dr. Maxwell explained it. And then I began to take him a little bit off the pedestal in my mind. I still admire him. He accomplished a lot of good things, but he also had some prejudices that maybe weren't warranted.
Okay. Yeah, okay, fair enough. Well, did you brought that paper out to talk a little bit about some of the courses that you took,
Oh yeah,
I think. So
yeah. Here's the list of church history courses, and I can't remember whether I actually took early church. I think I did, but I know I took a survey of church history. Well, no, I think I was exempted from survey of church history because I had 2 semesters of church history in the undergraduate. I'm pretty sure I took church in the Middle Ages, and that would have been probably from Augsburger, but I don't know for sure. I took modern church history from Augsburger, I think. I took history of the Adventist church. No, I think I was exempted from that because of my undergrad. But I took development of SDA theology from Knight. And English Reformation I took from Douglas. Origin and Development of Methodism I took from Staples. History of Religion in America. I think I took it, but I can't remember who I took it from, so it's possible that I didn't. History of Religious Liberty I vividly remember because I took that from George Knight and did a major paper. And then there were several seminars. Oh, there was Development of SDA Lifestyle. I took that from George Knight. That was a very exciting course. That was possibly my favorite course in the seminary. During my doctoral program. And then there were a number of seminars that were kind of open-ended and were kind of put together on an ad hoc basis, depending on who needed it and who was available to take it, and so on. And some of those were, 2 students, 3 students. And but it's almost like personal tutoring by the professor. I took one from Strand that was, anyway. The doctoral program was pretty heavy in some of these ad hoc seminars. Development of Prophetic Interpretation was one that Domsteek taught. And I took that, and I also took a seminar in the development of prophetic interpretation, I believe. But those were the ad hoc seminars were kind of the mainstay of the doctoral program at the beginning. There wasn't that many courses. I took research methods from. It wasn't in the church history department. It was basically an introduction to Turabian with a mastery of footnote and bibliography style. That was the heart of it.
Yeah, not method and theory so much as more so citation styling.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. That's what it was like for me too.
Yeah, and it was a good practical course you needed for writing a dissertation. But
Sure.
Later on, and I think I sent you a list of our later courses in the concentration Adventist studies, and we eventually developed a historical research and historiography. But I think that was first taught in 2011. So that was fairly late. As we were, and we had a few years there that were just, we had the luxury of multiple professors in the department, and I was blessed to be chair at that time. I was half-time originally, and then a little bit less later. Editing seminary studies, and John Reeve was also part-time with seminary studies, and Nick Miller was part-time with Lake Union, and So we actually had 5 or 6 professors in the church history department. They weren't all full-time because we had other stuff, but it really was a wonderful time in the department in terms of having lots of different specialties. That was fun.
So, Dr. Moon, I noticed from your CV that after you finished your dissertation and you defended it and graduated in '93, I think it was, in 1997 you finished a master's, an MA in history. So I was curious to know why you chose to do an MA in history after you had already completed a PhD.
It's a very good question. I've sometimes wondered myself. Actually, I realized that the Adventist studies was fairly narrowly focused, and I did not have a lot of background in general church history, although I had some survey courses and things. And George Knight was urging me to do a postdoc at Notre Dame. And there was some logic to that, but I also thought it was a little daunting. And but I had this feeling that I really didn't have all the education I needed. Just lack of confidence, I guess. But I had some other friends that were urging me to do a master's in broader field, and I had never studied in a non-Adventist school. I came through church school, academy, Union College, MDiv at Andrews, pastored for 11 years, came back and did a PhD at Andrews. And there was something I wanted to know. I guess I wanted to see how I could do in a secular university. And there were stuff like that. And when it was all over, I really wondered if it had been worth the effort, because I was teaching full-time now at Andrews, and it really kind of put me on the stretch. But anyway, I went to Western Michigan University, which is just a little over an hour up the road, and the tuition was cheap, and it was basically a good experience. And I did some early American history, which was background for my Adventist studies, and I did some European history. Some of it was major background to the French Reformation, which is of interest to Adventists in prophecy and early modern Europe, and stuff like that. So I guess I had some, and I even had a little bit of church history that I got from them. But it was basically a good experience. Out of it, I gained a real confidence that my Adventist education had been very good, because I was close to the top of most of my classes without having the time to really study like I would have liked to. And I realized that that Adventist education at its best is very good education, and fully comparable to what's offered at a state university. So that was positive. And I did pick up, I had a course in historiography that was very useful, and because we hadn't had one yet at Andrews at that time. And I did a course in Anabaptist history, which, and I had an Anabaptist, I had a Mennonite student in my course, in my class up there, and he and I kind of hit it off as fellow Christians in a secular environment, and he invited me down to visit some of the, like Goshen College and the Mennonite Seminary in Elkhart, and I found that, so when Strand found I had an interest in Anabaptism, he said, well, I want you to teach a course in that then. So I started the first course that we had here and taught it off and on for as long as I was teaching full-time. And I found out that there was an excellent summer course being taught at the Mennonite Seminary in Elkhart in Anabaptist history and theology. And I took it from the professor who was visiting there for like a 3 or 4 week course in the summer. He taught at a Canadian university. He was a very well-versed Mennonite historian, and he taught an excellent course. And I used his textbook to teach my course. And so there were some very positive things that came out of it. But when it was all said and done, I thought, maybe I would have been better to just stay focused and get my dissertation published rather than investing all this time still trying to broaden out.
Sure.
But anyway.
Well, let's talk about that dissertation. You wrote on the relationship between Ellen G. White and her son, W.C. White.
Yes.
So you brought it with you too. Okay,
Yeah.
Great. There it is. There's the published copy. And you've got just 1 or 2 papers in there.
Yeah.
But why did you choose this topic? Why did you choose to write on this particular subject?
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting question. And I mentioned that I'd taken English Reformation from Walter Douglas. And one of Walter Douglas's heroes was Richard Baxter, who was a prominent Protestant church leader, theologian. And Richard Baxter had a book called A Christian Directory. And it basically was a list of what Christian behavior should look like in relation to the government, in relation to the community, in relation to the family, and personal behavior, something like that. It was divided into 4 books, I believe. But it basically described Christian lifestyle in a very comprehensive way. And at that stage in my development, I really thought that Adventists needed something like that. And this was going to be kind of a directory of what Adventist lifestyle should look like, with historical and theological backing. And so that was my interest, that I was going to write a dissertation on Adventist lifestyle. And so when it came time for me to get started, and I don't know exactly what year this was, it was not later than '89. So it was fairly, of course, the main classwork, I guess, could be completed in 2 years. So, and I was thinking early about it. Anyway, Gerhard Hasel was the dean of the seminary, and evidently it was his role to give guidance in those things, because I remember interviewing him within his office and telling him I wanted to get started on my dissertation, and when he found out what I wanted to do with it, he said, well, our lifestyle specialist here for Adventist lifestyle is George Knight, so you need to think about him as your advisor. So I went to see George Knight. And when I told George Knight what I had in mind, he smiled and responded very tactfully. He said, well, Jerry, he said, the problem with that is it's not the kind of dissertation, or not the kind of topic that you can just go to the library and pull down 50 books on it and research and write a dissertation. He says, this is the kind of topic that you collect materials all your life, and after you retire, you write the book. Which is another way of saying that it's a very difficult topic to handle, and you probably aren't up to it at this point. But anyway, he said, I really think that that a good, well, when we talked about some other things, and then he said, have you considered writing a biographical topic? A biography gives you some predictable limits, and there are many Adventist pioneers that have never had a biography written about them. And so we talked about a few. And then George Knight said, and he knew I was very interested in Ellen White, he said, you know, I've been hoping for years to write a biography of W.C. White. He said he was very influential in the early White estate. He was very close to James and Ellen White. He was very involved with everything from his youth up. And he said, I've been planning to write a biography on W.C. White. But he said, I have many books I plan to write, and I wonder if you'd like that one. He said, if you want that one, I'll let you have it, and I won't write on it. I thought that was really special of him. And it was perfect for me because W.C. White would give me a window into the whole White family and background to Ellen White's personal life, and I thought, you know, this is perfect. And so I just kind of eagerly grasped that, and George mentored me along the way. Eventually became my chair, and but I remember this happened before Daniel Heinz's defense, because I remember after that defense was over, and he was so disappointed because he was hoping for a quick graduation and he got a major revision. And I remember following George Knight to the elevator on the third floor of the library. And evidently we had already decided that he was going to be my chair, because I remember saying to him, I said, I've been observing here, and I said, I'm counting on you, or something to this effect. I said, I hope that when you and I are working together on a dissertation, that if we have any disagreements like this, that we can get them ironed out before we get to the defense. And he assured me that we would. But we had a very good relationship, and I just realized yesterday, as I got your list of questions and was looking at, you were asking me about the number of people that come through the program, and I pulled down my Vita, and where I have a list of all the dissertations I've chaired, and the ones that I was a reader, and the MAs I've chaired, and the ones that I was a reader. And there was one at the very beginning, the very first one that I chaired, and I couldn't remember what did he write on. I'm pretty sure he was not an Adventist study student, so I think he was a School of Ed student. And then I remembered he wrote on the history of Battle Creek College, and it was for a doctorate in education. And George Knight had mentored him, and when he came to dissertation time, George Knight recognized that I needed to cut my teeth on a dissertation. I hadn't chaired one yet. That was my first PhD dissertation I chaired. I had been reader on a couple, and so George Knight suggested that he take me as his chair, and he did, and we had a successful finish. But that's why the first one I chaired was not an Adventist studies student, although he could have been, because he did Battle Creek College. But anyway, that was just the first of many, many. I mean, George Knight gave me the topic for my dissertation. He steered a student toward me for my first chair experience. He repeatedly he would be continually getting invitations from people writing encyclopedias and stuff to write an article for their encyclopedia on Adventist history or some aspect of it. And he passed several of those to me, and he just kind of took me under his wing and treated me like his son for many opportunities he had to help me, and he did. So I just I owe a lot to George Knight.
And then you later worked with him as a colleague, right? So,
Yes, in fact, he was the one naturally in line to become the department chair. But he was too busy writing books. He didn't want to bother with being department chair.
of course not.
And I was too young to write a book. And I was good for sitting in committees and working out disagreements. And so he promoted me for the chair, and I became the chair and stayed there for 14 years. Meanwhile, he wrote about 2 books a year. And whenever he had a problem with administration, he'd come to me and we'd work that out.
Well, before you got to being chair, I mean, what brought you, how did you come to the department itself? Did you get brought into the church history department immediately after you defended and graduated?
It was 1 year afterwards. It actually could have been in '93, except that I had this bee in my bonnet to go to Western for an MA. So for that reason, it was postponed a year. I think that's the way it was. Anyway, I defended in the summertime of '93, like maybe August. And it may be that I could have started immediately. I think I asked for a year.
Okay. Is this roughly around the time, when does Maxwell die again? Is he, or retire maybe is the right word to say here?
Yeah, I think it's about the time Maxwell retired.
Yeah, he died in around 2000, is that right, maybe?
I'm not sure. It was several years later anyway.
Yeah, but okay.
He continued, and
you were kind of brought on as his replacement then in the department?
I think that's about right, yeah, because he still had filing cabinets in his office. He hadn't really moved out yet, and he was around some. And they didn't have an office for me, and Kenneth Strand was on the other side. When you go in the church history department, the old one in the basement, the secretary was in the middle. Mervyn Maxwell to the left and Strand to the right. And then a door down the hallway was Douglas's office. So when I came on, Douglas became chair, and I shared the office with Strand because he wasn't in the office a lot of hours. And I was also, they asked me the same day if I'd like to be associate editor of seminary studies, which was another dream come true. So I wasn't in the office many hours a day, and I had another office at seminary studies, and Strand was in and out. So we just sort of agreed on hours, and we shared the desk and
were you brought on before or after Domstedt was brought on?
Domstedt came on in '88, and I wasn't brought on until '93. So
right.
Domstedt was pretty well established by then.
Okay. Very good. Was it then, by that time, was it George Knight, Gerard Domstedt, and Jerry Moon doing Adventist studies?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that would have been about right.
And it's still hanging around. Well, actually now we only have 2. It's Abner Hernandez and Dennis Kaiser. And then
right.
I'm in the department only a quarter time.
Yes.
And so in 2003, Merlin Burt would get added to the
yes,
department. But,
and that was a great help. And Merlin taught a fairly heavy load. I think he was, and he took his salary. Instead of taking it personally, he had it credited to the budget for the tours.
Yeah.
The New England tours were basically funded with the contract pay that Merlin would have gotten for teaching extra hours.
Yeah. Well, we're kind of hinting at how things developed. So how have things developed since you finished your dissertation and were brought into the department in the Adventist Studies program? We mentioned a few of them here, but how else have things developed?
Well, not too much changed for several years. I don't recall, according to my records, the next actual graduate from our program after me, I graduated in '93. I think the next one was Michael Campbell in 2008. Now, I might be wrong about that. I should check more carefully. And I could check with the PhD program office. They'd have the actual complete records. But we did not have a church history, a PhD concentration in general church history until 2010 or 11.
Yep. It's 2011, I think. It's the year I started my master's.
Mm-hmm. And so we were gradually building the program, but we didn't have very many students in it. By then we had, they hadn't finished yet, but we had several students. And we were gradually developing more depth of course offerings. We had our seminars that just have a general number, and then you'd have a subtitle for different seminars. And John Reeve, when he came on, he began to develop 2 or 3 new seminars a year, and he chose ones that could be repeated with slightly different emphases in a following year. And so he began to really develop some depth in that area. And Dom Steekt and I were also developing some seminars, but it wasn't until we started the church history, and I guess the church history was waiting until we had the depth. We began to offer Latin. We began to offer a historiography course, and it seems like there was 1 or 2 other courses that we didn't really have until 2010, and that's why we believe that we now could justify calling it a PhD in church history.
Mm-hmm. And that was the second PhD that you could get from the church history department, right?
Yes. So we still had a PhD in Adventist studies, and some were still taking it, particularly if they were preparing to be the director of an Ellen White Research Center or a Heritage Center. And some of our students who went to South American Division were in seminaries there where they had an Ellen White Research Center or a Adventist Heritage Research Center, and they worked in the Center for Adventist Research here, and then would do Adventist studies. But more and more, once we had the church history, everybody recognized that you had more courses you could teach, and so you had more marketability if you had a church history PhD than just an Adventist studies PhD. So the number of students taking Adventist studies as such have somewhat dwindled. We've had several that took a church history with a major focus on Adventist studies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, good. Okay. Anything else that we want to add about the histories of these things? I asked a few questions on the list, such as other Adventist Studies PhD programs starting out overseas, or do you have much knowledge of that? I've seen...
Well, I know the IS has one.
Yep, IS has
and
one.
I think that was the first one. And that is interesting because IS is one of the first people to hire some of our new graduates that are just beginning in their teaching career, and sometimes they're not quite ready to break into the competition here in the States, but IS teaches in English and has quite a few Americans there already. So we've had several guys go to IS, and it was just made sense that IS would start an Adventist Studies degree, and they have, I think, several students there that have gone there because it's so much cheaper than coming to Andrews. If you're from a third world country and you got to finance a PhD program, why IS is a bargain compared to Andrews.
Yeah, there is.
So that's a good thing. They're filling an important place there.
Mm-hmm. I've seen Newbold had advertised it, at least in the early 2000s, and
okay.
Avondale too.
What about La Sierra? Did they have something?
I don't know that they have a PhD in it.
Yeah, okay.
But
Okay, so Newbold and Avondale. Well, and those make sense also for the same reason that it's so expensive to come to the U.S.
Well, good. What about the church history department itself? What's in with that? What are the major developments that you've seen in your tenure in that department? We mentioned the PhD in church history in 2010, 2011,
Right.
somewhere in there, but what
Well,
other
another
developments?
major development was when Merlin Burt came in 2003, I think it was, and he initiated a closer relationship between the teaching staff. I mean, our department's always had a fairly close relationship with what used to be called the Adventist Heritage Center and the White Estate. It used to be two separate entities here, White Estate Research Center and the Adventist Heritage Center. And when Merlin came, those were merged into one. And and Merlin was very proactive and aggressive in developing new programs and outreaches. And he was eager to teach, and we were eager to have him teach. So he began teaching development of SDA theology, and I believe he taught Ellen White writings pretty much every year. And then sometimes he'd teach a seminar. And he did tours to New England places with, and he would teach on the bus and get credit for it, and give credit, course credit for the students. And I took a couple of those with him and taught courses on the bus. And that worked pretty well, actually. And to talk about Adventist history while you drive and then to view it when you get there is a pretty nice combination. Anyway, Merlin started a lot of that stuff, and because he had a enormous capacity for work, he was willing to teach. His contract called for teaching one course, but he was teaching 2 and sometimes 3 courses. And instead of taking a cash payment on his salary, he would ask that to be credited to the budget for his New England tours, and that enabled him to offer scholarships to students that couldn't afford to pay the full cost and various things like that. So Merlin really initiated a closer relationship between the Center for Adventist Research and the Church History Department, and he taught so much that we became dependent on him. And so that was a very positive development, and I think it strengthened the department significantly, and especially then after when Dr. Domsteegt and I both retired, it really weakened the department in terms of Adventist studies, but Merlin helped to counteract that. And then Dennis Kaiser finished, and he's very strong. And Abner Hernandez is also, he's very good. Not sure, I'm trying to remember if he was in actually Adventist studies or he was in church history.
Church history, I think, and he did his dissertation on Jacob Arminius.
Right.
Yeah.
His dissertation was on prevenient grace.
Mm-hmm.
And which is certainly relevant to Adventist theology, but he recognized that we had a need there, and he just basically volunteered to work in that direction. He taught development of SDA theology on a contract basis for us quite a few times as a student. And one thing about Abner is that he has a very well-rounded, practical Adventist education experience, and he was the vice rector of our seminary in Cuba. And then he told me that for years his ambition had been to go to Andrews for a PhD, and in the year 2000, he took the course in Development of SDA Theology at Montmorelis, and I was there, and he was top of the class. There was a big gap between number 1 and number 2. He'd like finished the semester with almost perfect score on everything possible. Anyway, he was very good, and he was collecting, for years he was collecting books on Arminius and Prevenient Grace. And anyway, the Lord finally opened the way for him to come, and we found that because he had such a broad practical experience in Cuba and Mexico and other places, that when he was giving an extension school in, it could be Canada or any place, he could handle everything that came up because he just had a very pastoral heart and a very good sense of how to handle controversial stuff, and so he fitted right into the department. He did very well, and so he agreed he'd take over. He'd equip himself to teach some of the courses in Adventist studies too. So between that and yourself, I think we have a pretty good program, pretty strong program still in Adventist studies.
Well, great. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think we've covered the gamut of the questions for the most part.
Oh, there was one thing you had on here, and that was, have there been any major donors?
Oh, yes.
And
that's right.
And I'm not sure if this is a direct donor to the Adventist Studies program, may have been more to the PhD program in general, but Ed Zinke gave huge amounts of money, and I don't even know the amounts, but Dick Davidson could probably tell you, or Tom Shepard, or Roy Gain. These were all previous PhD program directors, and I know that Ed Zinke, the Lord blessed him and his wife with a business that made lots and lots of money, and they poured lots of it into PhD program.
Yeah, okay.
So.
And that it would have included Adventist studies, but not limited to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Good. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Welcome.
So I guess we can call it good.